Hello and welcome to this episode of Eastman's Predator Pros. I am your host, Geoff Nimnick. Great to be back on the mic with you. It's been a pretty exciting last couple weeks. I haven't had a chance to get on and record one of these in the last probably 3 weeks. Had lots of guided hunts, coyote schools, even had a contest thrown in there. So the coyotes have been hitting the dirt. Season's off to a great start. But today I wanted to get into kind of what I call a meat and potatoes episode. Not going to be a whole lot of stories and, fun, entertaining things like that. But this is really going to hopefully give you just, when it comes to tips and tactics, this is where it's at, and we're going to specifically talk about sound selections and sound sequences and how long am I playing particular sounds for and all the reasoning behind that. At all the questions I get on social media and emails and things like that, this is one of the big ones I get. So I figured early on in this podcast series, it would be great to throw this out there to you and essentially hopefully give you the whole, coyote season that's ahead of us to use and put to use and see how you can make it work for you. But before we get going, I need to thank the sponsor of this episode, which is SigSauer Optics. Now, if you've followed me for a while, you probably think, well, SigSauer Optics, I thought Geoff shot loophole. And, I have. I've shot loophole scopes for a long time. But, the nature of this podcast, it takes sponsors. It takes time and money to bring this to you guys. And ultimately, SigSauer, stepped up and said, you know what, we love the idea of what you're doing. We love the fact that you're, making people better coyote hunters. You're bringing this to everybody. We want to be part of it. So, I was excited to have them as part of it. Wasn't real familiar with what they offered for optics. So, once these conversations started happening, I got to looking, on their website, and I was pretty blown away with the technology they offer in their optics. Their scopes, their rangefinders, their rangefinder binoculars. I think it's going to be an exceptional tool, especially for me when it comes to shooting coyotes. I do shoot some coyotes out there, 400 or 500 yards. The coyotes that hang up and just won't come any closer. Being able to kill coyotes out that far is important, I think. So the way this Bluetooth technology works in all these SigSauer optics. It's a signal basically between your scope and your rangefinder binoculars. And, before you head to the field, you get onto their app, you enter all your ballistic information about your rifle and your bullet and your things, everything that goes with that. And then once you go out and everything's set up, once I shoot a range with my rangefinder binoculars, instantaneously a red dot, a holdover dot, will come up on my vertical crosshair, meaning it'll be below the horizontal line, and that will be the dot where I hold the crosshair to make that shot at that distance. So it's going to be super fast. My old system, I would have to shoot a range. I'd have to spin the dial to 400 or 500 yards, then get in the scope and make the shot. Now I essentially just have to shoot the range, go directly right to the scope, and the dot will be there, all ballistically calculated, ready to go. So I haven't got anything yet with all the shipping delays and things that are going on right now. It may be a while before I get anything, but definitely excited to put it to use and tell you guys all about it when I do get my hands on it. So thanks SigSauer Optics for sponsoring this episode. And I'm sure in your mind you're thinking right now, everybody has their favorite sounds that they play, and I'm sure now, if you've never thought of it that way, I'm sure now you can start to say, okay, oh yeah, that sound I like to play, oh, that would fall in the prey distress, and oh, this other one I like to play, it plays, would fall into that pup distress or coyote fight, category, or oh, this one plays in the vocals. All right, so I'm sure the wheels are turning already, and you're seeing, where those sounds that you're familiar with, fall in each of those three categories. Now, to take this one step further, let's look at the 4 reasons or the 4 categories why coyotes come to the call. All right, what I refer to them as triggers sometimes. What are we triggering within that coyote to make them want to come to the sound? All right. Now, you could probably maybe make more categories than 4, I'm guessing. And, I've always kept it to 4 just out of simplicity a little bit more than anything, just so people can understand the theory and the concept behind this. So the first category is hunger. Probably the most obvious. We're playing the rabbit. We're ringing the dinner bell. The coyote's hungry. It's January. There's snow and the coyote's running to the call. Okay? Hunger, number 1. Number 2, curiosity. Curiosity kills more than just cats. It kills lots of coyotes, I think, too. I think a lot of times coyotes might not necessarily be hungry. They might not be extremely aggressive. They're just, hey, wonder what's making that sound. Let's go check it out. I think those are the coyotes that come, diddy bopping in, not real aggressive. You may consider it more of a cautious, sneaky coyote. To me, those might just be curious coyotes. You're just not triggering anything aggressive in them, but they are responding for that reason of curiosity. The third category, territorial. I'm sure a lot of you have probably thought about this one before, especially later on in the season. We talk about that coyote life cycle, and coyotes are pairing up. They become more territorial. They are establishing a territory, and they don't want any other coyotes in there. I think there's some other aspects to that territorial instinct. I think if you have a lot of coyotes in an area, and, let's say you're playing a wounded rabbit sound, and Coyote A knows that Coyote B is somewhere in that area, Coyote A may take off running harder to the call just because he thinks he has to beat Coyote B there. I think that's kind of a territorial response. Not that coyote's so hungry that he's sprinting to the call. I think it's the fact that he's just trying to beat other coyotes there. And some may think, okay, that's kind of a greedy aspect as well. I think greed is a big one. I think coyotes are a greedy animal. So I think greed could possibly, kind of be a little sub drop-off category of territorial, if you really wanted to put another one on there. Now that fourth category, and this is one I've thought about for a long, long time, and I don't know if I ever have, the name I have with it might not be the best, but I'm going to call it kind of that parental or social response trigger, okay? And what I mean by that is this, in an earlier episode I talked about, early season tactics, and I talked about the coyote life cycle. And if you understand that coyote life cycle, by nature, coyotes are, independent, solitary animals, okay? They're not pack animals like wolves. But during certain portions of the year, the coyotes do have this family dynamic. When a pair of coyotes have some pups, it's kind of a family for a while. And, they keep this family together, for 4 or 5 months, and then pretty soon the pups are big enough and they start dispersing out, and then maybe even mom and dad split and they go separate ways, and now they're all kind of back to being lone, individual coyotes again. But during that time, I think they develop certain bonds and things that are instinctual, and that parental and social trigger is really what we're talking about when it comes to that. So now to kind of lay this back out for you again so you can start visualizing it. So, if you took a piece of paper, you'd have 3 circles up top, and you'd have prey distress written in one. You'd have coyote vocals written in the second one. And over on the third one, you'd have coyote fights, coyote pup distresses, and breeding sounds. Now underneath, you would have 4 circles. And the left circle would say hunger. The second circle would say curiosity. The third circle, territorial. And the fourth would say parental, social. So now we can start connecting the dots. All right, we can start drawing lines. So essentially, if I play a prey distress sound, which one of those triggers am I hoping to invoke a response out of? So obviously, with prey distress, I'm triggering a hunger instinct. I can also trigger a curiosity instinct. And like I mentioned earlier, I think you can trigger that territorial instinct as well. Just if there's a lot of coyotes in the area, they're kind of racing just to be the first one there. Now with coyote vocals, obviously you're not triggering a hunger response, so that one doesn't get a line over to it. But you could trigger a curiosity response, and you could trigger a territorial response. Now some may argue that you could trigger some sort of parental response. If those coyotes are used to communicating with each other in some way, and then now they're dispersing out, they may use some coyote vocals to get back with each other. I don't look at it quite that much into that much depth, but you could possibly draw, let's say, a dotted line over to that one. Now that third category, coyote fights, pup distresses, and breeding sounds. Obviously curiosity, curiosity is the main one. I think triggers all, could relate back to all 3 sound categories. Territorial is another one I think that can relate back to all 3. But the main one that sound category of coyote fights, pup distresses, and breeding sounds triggers is that parental and social instinct. Now, over the years, of me developing these theories, and that's really what they are. I mean, anything in coyote hunting is essentially a theory. I really wish there was a way that we could prove a lot of this, and ultimately there's just not. I mean, there's no way we could ever have a crystal ball where we could see that coyote that's out there at 400 or 500 yards, that we can't see from sitting on stand exactly what that coyote's doing. So really in coyote hunting, I feel like, we have all these theories, and everybody has their own theories. And all these theories are based off a very, very small sample size. Maybe a few things we've seen over the years, and now we've developed these big, broad theories based off just a couple small things we've seen. So, for this category, I go back a long time, and way back in the world of coyote hunting, before ecalls were even around, okay, and guys used nothing but hand calls. And at some point, some guy on a hand call decided that a coyote affected coyotes different than him just blowing it like a wounded rabbit. And anybody that knows anything about coyotes, maybe you don't, you can take an open reed call and you can kind of make a squealing kind of yip, 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 yip kind of sound on a call to sound like kind of like a wounded coyote, pup distress kind of sound. So at some point, whether it was 50, 60, 80 years ago, I don't know how long this was, some guy, was the inventor of the coyote and decided that, this is a sound that affects these coyotes a little bit different than just the old rabbit squall. And, over the years, people started using this and the word spread, I think, and they realized that it's a pretty effective technique, a pretty effective way to call in coyotes, especially maybe after you've shot at a coyote. Maybe a pair of coyotes came in and you shot the first one and the second one's running off. That's one of the first things, if you probably read some literature or something like that, you've probably came across that after you shoot a coyote, the first thing you should play on your hand call is a coyote or go to some sort of pup distress. And over the years, through these small sample sizes, guys have switched to a coyote, and this coyote that either just got shot at, maybe he just watched his buddy get smoked right beside him and he's running for his life, all of a sudden you switch to this coyote, and this something different triggers within that coyote and causes them to, I've seen coyotes, do a 180 and kind of loop and come running right back in. I've seen them duck into the cover, and then pretty soon they pop out and they come running back out. And that's not every coyote, but I've seen it happen more times than not to think that, this is a different trigger within these coyotes. And that's where I've come up with this parental or this social trigger. It's very powerful. To me, it's one of the, probably out of all the 4 triggers, it's the most powerful, meaning I don't think coyotes, can control it as much, meaning if you have a smarter, educated, more pressured coyote, I think their brain, they're just smart. They know that can override their stomach, for example, meaning I don't care how hungry that coyote is, if he hears the wounded rabbit and he's been educated or pressured to some extent, I think that coyote's brain is going to override his stomach. And he's going to be like, no, I'm not falling for that again. But when you start making triggers from the territorial and especially this parental and social trigger group, you're triggering something within inside that coyote's brain that I think they have a hard time controlling. No matter how smart, how pressured, whatever it may be, you're triggering something different and you get a different response out of there. So keep that in mind. So ultimately, the plan is when I sit down on stand and I play a variety of sounds, and just to give you a quick idea, I never play less than probably 3 different sounds every stand I make. Some stands I'll play upwards of 5 or 6 different sounds. And in a minute, I'm going to get into how long specifically am I playing each one of those sounds. But the moral of the story is here, when you're playing different sounds on stand, I want to jump from category to category when I switch sounds. I don't want to really stay within the same category, and this is the reason why. Let's just say there's a coyote out in front of us. We don't know that there's this coyote there. We're hoping there's a coyote there, but there is a coyote there. And I start off by playing a cottontail distress sound for 4 minutes, okay? We know that cottontail falls within the prey distress category, and essentially we're hoping to really key on the hunger, more likely in the curiosity, possibly that territorial response with a prey distress sound. So for whatever reason, this coyote hears this cottontail sound out there, but the coyote's not hungry. He's not curious. We're just not triggering any of those responses within that coyote. So after 3 or 4 minutes, I switch and I say, I'm going to play a bird distress. So now I go into a sound like lucky pecker. Well, what category does lucky pecker fall in? Same exact category, right? So it triggers the same exact response. So more than likely, the coyote that wasn't interested in the cottontail, that didn't trigger the hunger, curiosity, or territorial response, playing that lucky pecker from the prey distress category is not going to trigger a hunger, curiosity, or territorial response from that coyote. So essentially, in my mind, I've just wasted 3 or 4 minutes playing a sound that, should have triggered the sound before because it comes from the same category. So when I switch up sounds, I'm switching categories. So now when I get done playing Cottontail, I go to a sound over in the pup distress category, coyote fight sound. On the Lucky Duck, for example, like pup chaos, let's say. So I go to pup chaos. Now that same coyote that wasn't hungry, that wasn't curious, maybe wasn't territorial, now I have the chance of invoking that parental or social trigger. And now that coyote that wasn't, all of a sudden I trigger that fourth instinct, and here that coyote comes, here he responds to the call, and I shoot that coyote. So keep that in mind when you're bouncing within a stand from sound to sound. We're switching category to category. Now the order of those categories can vary greatly, and we're going to talk a little bit about that. A lot of times I'll relate that back to the coyote life cycle and the time of year. If it's early in the season, you just understand that, roughly 50, maybe upwards of 70% of the coyotes out there that you're calling in are going to be those 5, 6, 7-month-old coyote pups. As we get later in the season, you just understand the dynamic that now these coyotes have been hunted pretty hard. They've been pressured. They've been chased around. They've been shot at. A lot of maybe the more aggressive or even the stupider coyotes are dead now. Now we're dealing with the smarter, less aggressive things, the coyotes that are still out there. But lucky for us, like we talked about with that coyote life cycle, come January, they're starting to pair up. They're becoming more aggressive. Now those coyote pups are now 9, 10 months old, which means they're just going to be naturally more aggressive. So now, I can maybe use some of those, more aggressive sounds. Now, I want to back up a little bit too and talk about the aggression scale within each of these categories. This is something important to consider. So if you take the prey distress category, you have an aggression scale within there. You have less aggressive and more aggressive. So a less aggressive sound in the prey distress category would be a sound like stinky rat or prairie dog distress or baby cottontail demise, a real high-pitched, squeaky, more of a rodent-based sound. Now, what I would consider your more aggressive bass sounds are your high, your growly, loud jackrabbit sounds. Even some of your cottontails like TNT, sounds like that are just growlier, more aggressive. You just can naturally hear that in those sounds. Those are the more aggressive. Now, if you go to your coyote vocal category, should be pretty self-explanatory. Less aggressive is going to be those lone pup howls. There's a high-pitched female howl in there I use a lot called Sookie 01 long howl. There's another one called Smoke long howl. Just a high-pitched female, pup howl. Those are going to be your less aggressive. Now, when you go to the more aggressive side of the scale on the coyote vocals, now you're looking into probably some of the serenades like Psycho Serenade, the pair howl where you get kind of a deep male in there howling, maybe an older female, even some of the challenge howls may be more aggressive. Now, as you move over into that third category, the coyote fights, pup stresses, breeding sounds, you have some less aggressive sounds, probably a lot of the squeaky pup sounds like pup chaos, Pee-wee Loco, just the pup distress number 9, even like breeding sounds like the female whimpers and things I think would be over on the less aggressive. And then as you move across the scale there, you get over into the very, very aggressive. You get sounds like coyote coon fight, fight club. I think there's one called breeding threesome. There's some really knockdown, drag out fights, lots of deep growling and yelping and, you can just tell that that's the more aggressive sound. So keep that in mind when you're going from category to category as well. As a general rule of thumb, I'll start a stand off less aggressive, and by the time I end that stand, I want to be as most aggressive as I possibly can. Therefore, I'm covering the entire spectrum of possible coyotes out there that are wanting to come to the call. And why I start less aggressive is for the simple fact that I just assume that the coyote that may be out there may be just a little wuss coyote, a little less aggressive, coyote, and I don't want to scare that coyote off by playing a more aggressive sound. And then knowing that some of those more aggressive, maybe older coyotes could possibly be some of the smarter, more pressured coyotes, and by the time the stand ends, I'm keying on that. I'm playing more aggressive to maybe trigger those coyotes that maybe those older, smarter, pressured coyotes, whatever you want to call them, that sat out there for 6, 8, 10 minutes and listened to the whole sequence I played so far. Then all of a sudden I play one of those more aggressive sounds towards the end, and that's the sound that finally triggers that response in that coyote, and they come to the call. So keep all that in mind. To back up a little bit, we're jumping from category to category, okay? And we're also thinking about that aggression scale in there. There's no set way to do this. I mean, there's not a set formula that says, hey, you have to start in the prey distress sound, and then you have to go to the pup distress, and then maybe back to the prey, and then you got to go back to the pup distress, or you have to start with a coyote vocal and then go into a prey distress. There's no set way in that, and I don't really have a set formula that I use. It's just kind of a feel thing for me. A lot of times early on in the season, I will start with more prey stuff just because I know that the coyote population is mostly pups, especially as we get into November. A lot of the food sources now are going away. We're finally starting to get some winter. We've had some freezes. All the easy food sources that these pup coyotes and other coyotes have been living off of are going away. And essentially they have to start meat hunting is what I call it. They're going to have to start catching voles and digging up mice and catching rabbits and birds and things like that. They can't just walk around eating grasshoppers and lizards and snakes and frogs and fruit and cactus blossoms and things like that. So, and then as we progress throughout the season, I know that the dynamic is changing. We're getting into that breeding season. Coyotes are becoming more territorial. I also know that the coyotes have been pressured a little bit. So I may scratch the entire prey distress category completely. I may sit down for a 10, 12, 15-minute stand and do nothing but sounds from the coyote fight, pup distress, and breeding category and the coyote vocals category. And there are sometimes I will do nothing but the pup distress and coyote fight category as well, depending on the situation. So keep that in mind that you don't always have to play rabbit. I think it's hard for people to say, it just doesn't feel like a coyote stand if I don't play at least a wounded rabbit, at some point, I've killed tons and tons of coyotes over the years where I never played rabbit, bird, anything on a stand, and you're keying on different things, and it's just understanding how that all sets up and how that all plays out. So now that we talked about these categories and these triggers, I want to go into one last bit of information for you guys on this podcast, and that's about time. How long am I playing sounds for? And that kind of, and when I talked about playing multiple sounds throughout, a stand, that's essentially a sound sequence, okay? So how long am I playing these sounds, and how long are these sound sequences playing out, which essentially is your time on stand. So a long time ago, I thought, when it comes to teaching in my schools and doing seminars and things like that, I thought, there has to be a way to, interpret this information so people can understand it. In my brain, it's simple, of why I do what I do, but I had to come up with a way to translate this so that, people could understand why I do what I do. So I came up with a pretty simple math equation, and I'm sure you're cringing now when I'm talking math equations, but this is essentially like, back in junior high, and you had the equation of, train A leaves the so-and-so at so-and-so time, and train B leaves here, and what time do they cross paths, It's essentially a story problem like that. And this is the math equation that I base a lot of things off of. And before I give you that, I want to set a couple ground rules here, not really ground rules, but, some information on how I base this off of. So we know that, coyotes on a dead sprint, coyotes are probably going 40, 43 miles an hour. Okay. But we know that most coyotes aren't coming to the call on a dead sprint. Even if they come on a really good run, they're probably going 25 miles an hour. But I'm trying to find an average, the average coyote coming to the call. And I know coyotes probably walk 4 or 5 miles an hour. So I always thought to myself, okay, what's somewhere in between there? So just for the simplicity of the math equation, I settled on 10 miles an hour, which is probably an understatement as far as how fast coyotes are responding to the call. But I figured 10 miles an hour is just a good trot. Coyote, the pace of a trot. The coyote's coming to the call, not stopping, just coming to the trot. So we're going to use 10 miles an hour. So the equation is this. If a coyote hears the call and likes what he hears, and he approaches the call on a 10-mile-an-hour trot, how long does it take that coyote to travel 1 mile? The answer, 6 minutes. Now, what we know off this is that more times than not, coyotes are not coming from a mile. If you called some big country over the years, you have probably seen coyotes come from farther than a mile if your visibility allowed you. But more times than not, I feel coyotes are coming probably closer to the 800 and under mark, which is a half mile. So if we know that a coyote on a 10-mile-an-hour trot can cover 1 mile in 6 minutes, a coyote should be able to travel a half mile in 3 minutes. So that's really that 3 to 6 minutes is really what I base all of my time of playing one particular sound on. So meaning this, if I'm playing sound A from whatever category, it doesn't matter, and that coyote likes that sound and makes an approach to my stand, within 3 to 5, 6 minutes tops, I should either see that coyote, shoot that coyote, miss that coyote, whatever. Because in 3 to 6 minutes on a 10-mile-an-hour trot, he should be able to cover that distance to the call. So any time past that 5 to 6 minute mark that I'm playing that same sound, in my mind, that is a waste of time. I'm wasting time on stand. Because if that was a sound the coyote liked, I should have seen him within that 3 to 6 minute mark. So that is the point when I go to switching sounds. Now I'm switching from sound A to sound B. And now sound B may come from, I may switch over to one of those other categories like I talked about, okay? So now I'm playing sound B for another 3 to 6 minutes. And if that coyote that was out there that didn't care about sound A now all of a sudden responds to sound B, I should see that coyote within 3 to 6 minutes. Now, there are some other factors in there that I consider. A lot of times in coyote hunting, there's a lot of different variables you got to sort through, and it's really just you making an educated guess of what you want to do and how you want to go about it. But I'll look at things like time of day. If it's early in the morning, late in the day, I know that coyotes are just naturally up on the move. And any time a coyote's naturally up on the move, there's a better chance that coyote's going to come from a farther distance. Okay? Now, if it's the middle part of the day, the coyotes are more than likely laid up. They're bedded up, taking a little nap. They're not going to want to respond. They're not going to want to come from as far. So maybe I might shorten that time down a little bit. Now, the terrain and the cover, that has a lot to do with it. If it's pretty wide open country and I can see quite a ways, I may shorten those down a little bit just because I can see out there quite a ways to see if anything's coming or not. The tighter the terrain, the thicker the cover is, I may extend those times out towards that, more towards the 6 minute mark per sound, just because I can't see if anything's coming. And then obviously wind speed is another one. If the wind's blowing a lot, I just know that naturally my sound's not traveling out as far. And just usually when it's real windy, the coyotes are laid up. They're bedded up. They're not wanting to move a lot anyway. Vice versa, it's pretty crisp, clear, calm sort of conditions. Then I know my sound's traveling out there quite a ways. And, the coyotes may hear it from out there a long ways, and I may hit the right trigger, and we may get a coyote coming from a mile or even further. So those are all the little variables that I'll put into that, and that'll kind of give me, if I give you the basis of 3 to 6 minutes, using those variables should be able, if you use those variables, you'll be able to determine, okay, am I need to play the sound closer to the 3 minute mark or closer to the 6 minute mark using those other variables. But that's really, as you go through that process, starting out less aggressive, more aggressive, by the time I get to my third sound, I may be somewhere up in that 10 to 12 minute mark when I finish it. And at that point, you have to determine, based off the stand, all these other variables that we're looking at, do I think at this point now, have I covered everything that I'm hoping to cover? And if so, then that means it's time to, hit stop and pack up and head to the next stand. But if you get to that 10 or 12 minute mark after that third sound and you say, I feel like there's still maybe some more to do. I got a couple other sounds I want to try, maybe more aggressive out of one category or less, then so now you're extending your stand out to maybe that 15 or even 18 minute mark. Then at that point you probably have exhausted all options and hopefully, you're packing up and heading to the next spot. Now, when it comes to, these time on stands, I've been a big believer in part of just the way I do things is kind of what I would call a run and gun approach. I'm looking for coyotes that are responding, within the first sound or two. I'm not really trying to key on these smart, sneaky coyotes that I might have to play, 6 different sounds, and this coyote's going to sneak in, and he's going to stop, and he's going to sit down, and then he's going to come to the call. I'm not wanting those coyotes. So I'm running, gunning. I'm making these 10, 12, 14, 15-minute stands tops, hoping to lay a sound on a set of ears, that are motivated and want to come to the call. As I'm doing this, I'm covering all the sound categories. I'm covering less aggressive to more aggressive. And basically, when I leave that stand, I'm thinking to myself, well, there just wasn't a coyote there, or it was just one of these coyotes that could care less of what I played. He's just not coming regardless. So it's time to go find some new coyotes instead of sitting there hoping that, I maybe find one sound that does, bring in this coyote. Now, I want to talk to you a little bit about the theory of playing multiple sounds, and how this sound category, comes in. So, over the years, I've seen this probably well over 20 times. It doesn't happen a lot, but a lot of times if you're hunting an area where you have visibility, you'll see coyotes that'll come in and check up. And what I mean by check up, they'll stop. They just hang up out there. They'll get to a point where they can see everything, and for whatever reason, they just don't want to come any closer. And, over the years of trying different things, it came to a point where I would just start playing sounds. I would play one sound for maybe 15 or 20 seconds. And if the coyote didn't like it, I would switch to a different sound. And I would play that sound for 15 or 20 seconds. And if the coyote didn't like it, I'd play the next sound. And I may go through 6, 8, 10, 12 sounds at some point. Now, over the years, roughly, 20 times I've seen this, where I may get to sound 4, I may get to sound 7, I may get to sound 9, but whatever it is, that sound, something triggers different in that coyote, and they come running in, and I shoot that coyote. Now, that process there of me seeing that happen just a few select times over the years has led me to develop this big theory about, what I just talked about, the 3 categories and the 4 triggers, and cover as many as possible. So basically what we're assuming is every time we sit down by playing different sounds, we have this same coyote that's sitting out there that we can't see. And the more sounds we play, the better chance we are of triggering that coyote to come to the call. So don't be afraid to switch up sounds. A lot of times you may be sitting on stand, or you may be thinking this right now in your truck driving and say, that doesn't even make sense. Why would I go from a screaming chicken to a pup distress, back to a coyote fight, then to a breeding whimpers, then to a coyote howl, then back to lucky pecker, every 30 seconds. If I have a coyote that hangs up out there, and, the way I look at this, coyotes don't think like you and I. I think coyotes have a very short-term memory. Like, they forget very easily. I think their long-term memory is pretty good, because I think they sense pressure, and they can be educated to some extent. But I think short-term like that, I think if you trigger that, I think they kind of lose of the fact that, why they were hung up in the first spot, and you're triggering something different in that coyote that causes them to want to come to the call. So keep that in mind when you are switching up sounds. Don't feel like it's got to sound realistic. I know a lot of guys try to throw out a scenario, maybe they'll start a stand with a few coyote howls, and then they'll go into a rabbit, and then maybe into, some sort of coyote fight after that. And, they're kind of laying out that scenario that, hey, there was a coyote here and he howled, and then now all of a sudden now the coyote, caught a rabbit, and now maybe the coyote's getting in a fight with another coyote, thinking that coyote out there that they're hoping to call in really buys into that, and I don't think coyotes necessarily, can reason like that and understand that, but it sounds good to us. And I'll play sequences like that as well, but the bottom line is that sequence that I just talked about, you were playing sounds from all 3 categories, and if it works, it works, So, moral of the story is this: don't be afraid to switch up sounds and keep them playing, anywhere from that 3 to 6 minute. When you switch up sounds, go from category to category, use that aggression scale, and think about that. Consider that, when you're playing based off the time of year you're calling, in the conditions, and, the pressure and everything else. And I'll guarantee you'll see more coyotes come to the call. Now, before I shut this episode down, I'm trying to go through my notes real quick here, just to make sure I kind of covered everything. But it looks like that was about the gist of it. We're right on schedule for about what I thought this would take to explain this particular concept, of sound selections and time on stand and things like that. Now over the course of these podcasts, I'll relate back to some of this stuff, and when you say, hey, you might be listening to a story at some point, and I'll talk about playing this sound or that sound, and then switching to that sound, and then this helps give you an idea of the thought process that I use when it comes to that, and you'll be able to relate back to that. So don't be afraid to switch up sounds. I'll guarantee you're going to kill more coyotes this winter doing so. But that ends it. That's gonna end it for today. Once again, want to thank SigSauer for sponsoring this episode. Got some great things. This initial dump. Hopefully, you're kind of binging right now. There's going to be 5 episodes dumped right now that you'll have access to, and then we're going to launch an episode every 2 weeks for the remainder of the year. So I'm going to try to keep things on pace as far as episodes per the time of year. We're going to get into some stories. I've been hunting a lot now. We're going to be hunting a lot, filming for The Last Stand. I'm going to get guys on the show, and we're just going to talk about hunts and things like that, and hopefully throw in a bunch of tips and tactics and things that happen during these hunts that hopefully you can use. But once again, thanks to SigSauer. Appreciate Eastmans sponsoring this. They got a bunch of stuff going on right now with Tag Hub. I'm not a big game hunter at all, but I'm sure some of you out there probably hunt big game early in the fall and then spend the rest of your winters hunting coyotes. So check out all the stuff they got going on Tag Hub right now. They're getting into the season of putting in applications and things for a big game season next year already. So be sure and check that out on their website. If you'd like more information about myself, like I've said in the past, easiest thing to do is probably just go to my website, which is coyotecraze.com. That has links to the YouTube show I run called The Last Stand, or host called The Last Stand with Rick Paulette. It'll have links to magazine articles I've written. It'll have, just some other information about myself, as well as links to all my social media accounts, really Instagram, which is just at Geoff Nimnick, and that's Geoff. Search that, and you'll find it on Instagram. That's really where I put most of my content. So be sure and check that out as well. But that's all I got for now, guys. Appreciate you listening. We'll catch you next time. Thanks.